The final battle to reform Wall Street begins anew in Washington this week. Members of the House and Senate are expected to meet as soon as Thursday to begin hashing out a compromise. And as you might imagine, industry lobbyists are massing for an all-out assault. But they will have some competition from investors who have a very different perspective. Darren Gersh spoke with one of the leaders in the faith-based investment community, Father Seamus Finn.
It would be hard to find a place that, on the surface at least, appears less interested in the Wall Street money hunt than Washington's Little Rome. Clustered around Catholic University, dozens of religious orders make their home here. Orders like the Missionary Oblates of Mary Immaculate.
Is there something to be learned from that?
Which is where you'll find Father Seamus Finn. As a young priest, he first learned how the financial system on Wall Street directs the lives of the poorest people in the world.
It's kind of the vascular system of the world, and it's the blood that flows through, even the most remote communities, and its influence on people's lives is just tremendous.
Father Seamus saw the power of big banks first in the battle over apartheid in South Africa, and later in the Latin American debt crisis. But it was around the millennium when it first became clear how global the banking system had become.
We were looking at, things like risk, instability, liquidity, and, how that was contributing to what access to capital somebody in Malawi might have.
Father Seamus works with a broad coalition of faith-based groups at the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility. Its latest crusade started with the collapse of a Fortune 500 superstar.
We began discussing derivatives right after Enron. Our concern was, how does one measure, what kind of exposure, what kind of risk, what kind of instability are those instruments capable of introducing into the entire system if, in fact, they start to unwind or to unravel.
So Father Seamus and his colleagues began to set up meetings with regulators, who were not very helpful, and bankers, who weren't much better. Eventually, they saw through the financial smoke and mirrors.
There was an awful lot of this was happening off balance sheet, but there was a whole shadow side to this system that was not on there.
A shadow system that needed to be brought into the light. So Father Seamus and his colleagues asked the biggest banks to do something fairly simple. Tell the world what's on their books, what collateral backed those derivative bets on things like mortgages, and whether banks were lending out that collateral instead of keeping it on the books.
Our interest was primarily, can you at least tell us the policy? We weren't really asking them to do anything. We just wanted to know what's the policy.
Father Seamus and his colleagues at the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility have come close to passing shareholder resolutions at Goldman Sachs and other big banks requiring disclosure of derivative risks. The next battle is here in Washington. Father Seamus favors regulatory reform forcing banks to spin off their derivative operations.
I think it would be a recognition that, these things need to be handled carefully. It may be the difference between handling uranium and handling copper. Right? There's a certain thing about uranium that immediately puts up some red flags that says you got to be extra careful. And more careful than you are with some of the other stuff.
Extra careful because to religious groups like the Missionary Oblates and others, the fair functioning of the financial system is an issue of social justice.
Do you see the direct connection between what happened on Wall Street and the derivatives they created and how that affects the poorest people in the world?
That's been a consistent theme that we've tried to raise with the financial system and with the banks for 30 years. That the impact of the decisions that they make in their institutions, whether it's about lending and the criteria for lending and monitoring what's actually going to happen with the loan, has impact way out at the periphery that most of them never come in touch with, and most of them are never challenged to try and respond to.
Father Seamus is happy to see what he calls Wall Street's little club get a shakeup. But now he worries the result will send big banks searching the globe for regulators who are willing to look the other way. And if that happens, Father Seamus fears it won't be the wealthy bankers who pay the price. It will be the countless people those bankers will never see. Darren Gersh, Nightly Business Report, Washington.